They weren't beaten by the Japanese. They were left behind by their own. On the night of August 9th, 1942, 11,000 Marines woke up and found the American fleet was gone. No warning, no goodbye. Just an empty horizon where the day before there had been warships as far as the eye could see. Those ships took everything with them: food, ammunition, barbed wire, heavy equipment, everything you need to hold an island surrounded by the enemy. What was left? 37 days of rations, 4 days of ammunition, no air cover, no naval support, and an enemy that hadn't lost a single major ground battle since this war started. Washington had written the island off. The Navy had sailed away. Every military calculation pointed to the same conclusion. Guadalcanal was already lost. General Alexander Vandegrift stood on that beach and stared at that empty horizon. Then he turned his back on it. He opened his maps, and the decision he made in the next 6 hours would force Japan to do something it had never done in this war: retreat. This is the story of that night, and of the men who stayed. The greatest generation never asked for a parade, but they earned one. If someone in your family served anywhere, any branch, any war, put their name in the comments. Don't let their story disappear. To understand why a tiny island that appeared on almost no map in the world mattered so much, you have to understand where Japan stood in the summer of 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, they controlled a stretch of territory nearly the size of the continental United States. Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and now they were building an airfield on a small jungle island in the Solomon Islands, an island called Guadalcanal. That airfield wasn't a defensive installation. It was an offensive weapon. Operating from Guadalcanal, Japanese aircraft could directly threaten the supply lines running from the United States down to Australia and New Zealand. Cut those lines, and America loses its only staging ground for a counteroffensive in the Pacific. Every plan to push back against Japan would have to be thrown out and rewritten from scratch. Tokyo understood that. Washington understood it too. But the decision to strike back was made in such a rush it bordered on reckless. Planning took weeks instead of months. The maps the staff officers used to plan the landings were torn out of a National Geographic magazine. There were no proper aerial reconnaissance photos. No reliable information on terrain, weather, or how many Japanese troops were actually on the island. This is what Washington handed Vandegrift: an underprepared mission on an unsurveyed island, with troops who hadn't finished training. Vandegrift knew all of that. He took the orders and didn't complain, because he was the kind of general who understood something that a lot of people sitting in Washington didn't. Japanese ground forces in the Pacific hadn't lost a major engagement yet. Waiting until everything was ready meant waiting until it was too late. On August 7th, 1942, the Marines hit the beach at Guadalcanal. They took the airfield in a single day. The Japanese garrison, mostly construction workers and a small naval guard unit, ran for the jungle. They left behind their equipment, their food stores, their building machinery, everything still neatly in place. Vandegrift thought the hard part was over. He was wrong. The morning of August 7th, the Marines came ashore under naval gunfire from offshore. They were ready for a fight. It didn't come. The Japanese on the island, mostly construction workers and a small naval guard, fled into the jungle. They left behind everything: construction equipment, bags of rice, canned food, cases of Japanese beer still stacked in a storage shed. By the end of the day, the Marines held the unfinished airfield. Vandegrift sent a report back to command: progress better than expected. Nobody knew that was the last quiet moment the campaign would ever have. That same night, a few hundred miles to the north, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa was driving a task force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer hard toward Guadalcanal. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. In the early hours of August 9th, Mikawa's fleet slipped into Savo Sound in total darkness. No radar needed. The Japanese had spent years training for exactly this, night surface combat, while the American Navy had never made it a priority. What happened next took less than 40 minutes. 4 Allied cruisers went to the bottom: USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, the Australian cruiser Canberra. More than 1,000 sailors killed. It was the worst open-water defeat in the history of the United States Navy, and it happened while the Marines on the island were asleep. Mikawa looked around. The approach was wide open. American transports sitting offshore loaded with food, ammunition, equipment. Nothing left to protect them. He could have finished it right there. He didn't. Mikawa was worried about air attacks once daylight came. He turned his fleet around and headed back to Rabaul. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because those transports, even though Turner later ordered them out, had managed to offload just enough supplies to keep the Marines alive through the first months of the campaign. If Mikawa had destroyed them that night, Guadalcanal might have been over before it started. Admiral Turner got word of the Savo disaster before dawn. He ran the numbers. The escort fleet was effectively gone. Admiral Fletcher had already pulled his carriers out. Fletcher was worried about losses and left without giving proper notice. No air cover, no naval shield. Turner made his call. Every remaining transport, out, immediately, under cover of darkness. Nobody told Vandegrift before those ships weighed anchor. When the sun came up on August 9th, a Marine scout came running to find Vandegrift. He stepped outside and looked toward the water. Empty horizon. Not a single ship in sight. Vandegrift later wrote in his memoirs that it was the moment he felt completely abandoned. Not by the enemy, by his own navy. But he didn't write that at the time. At the time, he just walked back into his tent, called his staff officers together, and got to work. The staff meeting was quiet. Nobody panicked. Nobody raised their voice. Just officers sitting around a field table, looking at numbers on paper and understanding exactly where they stood. Vandegrift asked for a straight assessment, no sugarcoating, no false optimism. The results: 4 days of ammunition at full combat intensity, 37 days of food if they started rationing immediately. Not enough barbed wire to cover the full defensive perimeter, no artillery support, no air cover, and somewhere out there in the dark, an enemy already on its way. 11,000 men, on an island 90 miles long, no way out. 2 options on the table. Option 1, pull back, consolidate the entire force into a tight defensive ring around the beach, dig in, string the wire, wait for reinforcements. It was the safe call. The call every military textbook recommends when you're cut off and running low on supplies. Option 2. Finish the airfield. Not defense. Not waiting. Build the one thing that could change the math. A working runway. With an airfield, you can get aircraft. With aircraft, the Marines create their own air cover. No need to wait for the Navy to come back. But finishing the airfield meant moving men outside the defensive perimeter, spreading the force thin, accepting the risk of getting hit before they were ready. If the Japanese attacked before the airfield was done, there was no fallback plan. Vandegrift studied the map for a long moment. Then he pointed at the airfield. That decision wasn't made out of bravado. It came from seeing what option one didn't say out loud. Pulling back and waiting was just a slower way to die. Without the airfield, there was nothing to defend, nothing worth resupplying, and no reason for Washington to risk warships getting here. The Navy wasn't coming back for a beach, They might come back for an airfield. The airfield was the only reason to hold Guadalcanal. So finish it. The next morning, while one part of the force dug fighting positions, the rest picked up shovels and went to work on the runway, under tropical sun that hit 100 degrees by mid-morning, in uniforms already soaked through before 8 o'clock, on half rations starting that first day. Most of them didn't fully understand what they were building. They just knew their general gave the order, and they worked. August 18th, 1942. 11 days after the Navy left, a Japanese reconnaissance plane flew over Guadalcanal and took photos. The runway was finished. The pilot couldn't believe what he was looking at. 11 days earlier, this had been a half-built construction project in the middle of jungle. Now it was a functioning airstrip, built by hand, using equipment the Japanese had abandoned, by men eating 2 meals a day in 100-degree heat. Vandegrift named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway 2 months before. The next day, 19 aircraft landed on Henderson Field. Wildcats, Dauntlesses, old planes, patched-together planes. Not the best America had, but they were here, on the island, under Marine control. Guadalcanal had air cover. Those pilots called themselves the Cactus Air Force, after Guadalcanal's Allied code name. There was nothing romantic about it. They slept in foxholes next to the runway because tents couldn't survive the bombing. They flew 3-4 missions a day. Take off, intercept Japanese aircraft, land, refuel, take off again. Between sorties, they lay down under the wings of their planes and slept, still in sweat-soaked flight suits. Fuel came from field drums, some of it pumped from sunken ships offshore. When a plane took enough damage to ground it permanently, the mechanics stripped every usable part and bolted it onto another aircraft. Nothing got wasted. Some mornings a pilot would walk out to his plane not entirely sure how many other aircraft it had been assembled from. They flew anyway. 900 miles to the north at Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto studied the intelligence report and immediately understood the problem. Henderson Field wasn't just an airstrip, it was a trap. Any fleet that approached Guadalcanal during daylight hours fell within range of aircraft from Henderson. Japanese ships could only operate in those waters at night, enough to shell the island, enough to land troops, but not enough to retake it. Yamamoto understood that better than anyone. He ordered a ground assault to retake the airfield, sent in some of his best units, trusted that one hard push would overrun Henderson Field before it became too well defended to crack. He badly underestimated how fast Vandegrift had built his lines, and he completely underestimated the men who were going to hold them. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki arrived at Guadalcanal with 900 of Japan's finest troops and an absolute certainty about what was going to happen. He didn't need reconnaissance, didn't need artillery preparation, didn't need a contingency plan. He had Japanese soldiers. That was enough. On the night of August 21st, Ichiki led his men in a direct charge along the beach east of Henderson Field. Simple tactics, almost contemptuous in their directness. Drive straight into the Marine lines at midnight, use speed and bayonets to break through before dawn. It had worked in China, in Malaya, in the Philippines. It didn't work here. The Marines were waiting. Barbed wire stopped the first wave cold at the bank of the Ilu River. Machine guns opened up from both flanks. Within minutes, the white sand was red. Ichiki sent a second wave, then a third. Each one broke apart on the wire. When daylight came, Vandegrift sent tanks and a full battalion around behind what was left of Ichiki's force. No escape route, nowhere to go. 800 of Ichiki's 900 men died on that sand. Ichiki burned his regimental colors. Then he shot himself. It was the first time in this war that Japanese infantry attacked a properly defended American position and got wiped out. Not pushed back, not repelled, wiped out. Vandegrift didn't celebrate. He knew Ichiki was just the first wave. He was right. In September, General Kawaguchi arrived with nearly 3,000 men, 3 times what Ichiki had brought. And he wasn't going to charge straight up the beach. Kawaguchi had learned the lesson. He pushed his men through the jungle, over terrain Vandegrift believed was impassable, and aimed directly at the high ground south of Henderson Field, a narrow ridge that would later be called Edson's Ridge. Hold that high ground, you hold the airfield. Lose it, you lose everything. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi attacked. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's line, fewer than 800 men, held off nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers through the night. By 3 in the morning, the perimeter had shrunk to less than 100 yards. Some positions had already broken. Japanese troops were inside the wire. Edson walked the line, calm, not raising his voice, looking every man he passed directly in the eye. This is it. There is no better place to die. The line held. Vandegrift got the call at 3:30 in the morning. The perimeter was holding. Barely. He looked at the list of available reserves. 1 battalion left. If he committed that battalion and the line still broke, there was nothing left to save Henderson Field. Nothing left to save Guadalcanal. He committed the battalion. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi was pulling what was left of his force back into the jungle. More than 600 Japanese soldiers were dead on that hillside. Henderson Field was still standing. Vandegrift sat down and, for the first time in weeks, let out a long breath. But he knew exactly what that meant. He had just used his last reserves. If Japan came back with the same size force, he had nothing left to stop them. Second Lieutenant Roy Elrod arrived on Guadalcanal in November 1942, weighing 190 pounds. He left weighing 165. 25 pounds gone in a matter of weeks. Not from lack of trying, from lack of food. That was the reality of Guadalcanal after the big battles. Not artillery, not night attacks, just the island grinding men down, day after day, in its own quiet way. At night, the Tokyo Express ran. Japan couldn't move troops during daylight. Henderson Field controlled the sky. But the darkness was theirs. Japanese destroyers ran down the passage the Marines called the Slot, New Georgia Sound, at full speed, offloaded men and supplies on the beach before sunrise, and were gone before the Cactus Air Force could touch them. Every night they came. Every morning, Vandegrift looked at the map and knew more Japanese troops had just come ashore. There was no way to stop them in the dark. In the jungle, disease was killing more Marines than Japanese bullets. By the time the 1st Marine Division was finally relieved in December 1942, more than 8,000 of its men had contracted malaria. Tropical disease had taken 2 out of every 3 men off the line, while enemy fire accounted for only 1 in 3 casualties. Elrod remembered one night sitting on a wooden crate in the pouring rain, shaking with malaria, doubled over with dysentery, Japanese mortar rounds landing behind him, mosquitoes everywhere. He looked up at the sky and thought, I wonder why they can't get one of those rounds in here where it would do some good. That wasn't a man who wanted to die. That was a man who had hit the absolute limit and was still sitting there, still holding his position, because there was nowhere else to go. The order had come down. Unless your fever was over 104 degrees, you didn't leave your post for sickbay. Vandegrift knew all of it. He walked the forward positions every day, looking at hollowed-out faces, uniforms hanging off men who had nothing left to lose. He didn't tell them reinforcements were coming, because he wasn't sure they were. He sent a cable to Washington, not asking to withdraw, not complaining, just reporting the facts, so that if they couldn't hold, Washington would understand why. The cable went unanswered for days. The men who had been on the island longest were surviving on whatever the jungle could give them: coconuts, taro root, lizard meat, and rice taken off dead Japanese soldiers. These were the same men who had won at the Tenaroo River, who had held Edson's Ridge, who had built Henderson Field with their bare hands. Now they were eating their enemies' food to make it through one more day. And not one of them talked about quitting. While the Marines were holding on by their fingernails, something else was happening that neither side fully understood yet. Japan was bleeding out, not in troops, though the ground losses were severe, but in something far harder to replace. Over Guadalcanal's skies, Japan's most experienced aviators were dying mission by mission. These weren't ordinary pilots. They were the men who had trained for years before the war, who had flown over China and Burma, who had attacked Pearl Harbor and Midway. Japan had spent a decade building that corps of airmen. They could not be replaced in months. They could barely be replaced in years. Every day the Cactus Air Force scrambled to defend Henderson Field, it was trading patched-together wildcats and exhausted young pilots against Japan's irreplaceable veterans, and Japan was losing that trade badly. By the time the campaign ended, Japan had lost more than 600 aircraft over and around Guadalcanal. More importantly, the experienced crews who had given those aircraft their edge were gone. Yamamoto understood what that meant better than anyone in Tokyo. He had watched Japan's naval air power, built over a decade, tested at Pearl Harbor and Midway, get systematically destroyed over a jungle airstrip in the Solomon Islands. He knew what came next. Japan could still fight. But the kind of war they could fight in 1943 was not the same war they had launched in 1941. The initiative was gone. The experienced aviators were gone. The margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing, all because the men on that island refused to leave. On October 18, 1942, a message reached the officers on Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley had been relieved of command. His replacement, Admiral William Halsey. The Marines read that and, for the first time in weeks, laughed. Not because Halsey brought immediate relief, not because everything changed overnight, but because that name meant Washington had finally figured it out. Guadalcanal wasn't a place for passive defense. It needed someone willing to fight. Halsey fought. Supplies started arriving with more regularity. Reinforcements came in. The Cactus Air Force got more planes. For the first time since August, Vandegrift could look at his map without calculating how many days he had left. But here's what history tends to gloss over. Halsey arrived on October 18th, the Battle of the Tenaroo. Marines won. Edson's Ridge. Marines held. Henderson Field finished and operational. All of that happened before Halsey set foot in the area. Vandegrift had held Guadalcanal for 11 weeks. No navy, no reliable supply line, no clear orders beyond 2 words: hold. Halsey didn't save Guadalcanal. He took an island Vandegrift had already held together with his bare hands and carried it to final victory. In December 1942, the 1st Marine Division was pulled off the island. The men who could still walk made their way to the beach on their own. The ones who couldn't were carried. More than 8,000 of them had malaria. Most had lost 20 pounds or more. Their uniforms hung off bodies that looked nothing like they had 4 months earlier. They looked back at the island one last time as the ships pulled out. Nobody recorded what they were thinking. But the island was still theirs. In February 1943, Japan quietly evacuated the last 10,000 soldiers remaining on Guadalcanal over 3 consecutive nights. The withdrawal was executed so perfectly that American intelligence initially thought it was a new offensive. When the truth was confirmed, Guadalcanal was over. For the first time in this war, Japan had given up territory it had taken, not because they were outnumbered, not because they ran out of weapons, but because they had run into something their military machine had no formula for: men who'd been left behind and refused to lose. Alexander Vandegrift never became a household name. No Hollywood blockbuster, no iconic photograph with sunglasses and a corncob pipe, no quote in the history textbooks that every school kid can recite. He was just the man who stood on a beach on the darkest night of the war, watched the last ship disappear, and turned his back on that empty horizon. In 1943, Vandegrift was awarded the Medal of Honor, not for a single moment of heroism, for 4 straight months of making the right call when there was no right call to make. General Douglas MacArthur said it best after the war was over. Before Guadalcanal, the enemy advanced at his pleasure. After Guadalcanal, he retreated at ours. That shift, from Japan advancing to Japan retreating, started on a half-built runway in the jungle, built by starving men with Japanese equipment on an island their own navy had abandoned. Every campaign that came after, Bougainville, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The road to Tokyo itself ran through that runway. It didn't belong to the admirals who sailed away. It didn't belong to the generals in Washington. It belonged to the men who stayed. They were abandoned. They stayed. They won.
On August 19, 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki landed on Guadalcanal with 917 of Japan's finest soldiers. He had a diary in his breast pocket. He had already written the schedule for the next 3 days. August 20th, Night March. August 21st, Enjoy the fruits of victory. No entry for August 22nd. He didn't think he'd need one. 3 days later, 128 of those 917 men were still alive. The rest were on a white sand beach under the Guadalcanal sun. At Rabaul, when the radio report came in, the operations officer, a man who had met Ichiki personally before he boarded ship, read it twice, set it down, and said, "I think this report is incorrect." Not because he doubted the numbers. Because Ichiki could not have lost. It was that simple. General Hyakutake called the next man in, spread the map of Guadalcanal on the table. The second man came with 6,000 troops. He failed too. The third time, Hyakutake came himself, with 20,000 men, heavy artillery, and a staff already assigned to plan the surrender ceremony. He failed worse than either of them. 3 times, 3 men, and one question that none of them ever asked out loud, not because they weren't intelligent, but because the answer would have destroyed something they had believed their entire lives. December 1941. Singapore fell in 70 days. The photograph of British General Percival signing the surrender document ran on the front page of every newspaper in Japan. Percival was tall, thin, pale, walking toward the Japanese delegation with a white flag, his uniform hanging off him like it belonged to a larger man. The photograph was reproduced millions of times, framed in government offices, pinned to barracks walls, not to inform, to confirm what they already knew. At Japanese military academies, cadets were taught one principle above all others, repeated in every lecture, written into every training manual. Yamato spirit overcomes material strength. The idea wasn't a slogan. It was treated as a military law, as verifiable as ballistics. Tested in China, proven in Malaya, demonstrated again and again against enemies who had more equipment, but less will. The intelligence assessment of the American Marines at Guadalcanal, August 1942. An internal document, not a propaganda poster. American soldiers lack discipline, are incapable of coordinated night combat, and will break under direct and sustained pressure. Every officer who read that assessment had evidence to support it. The fall of the Philippines, the collapse at Wake Island, the retreat at Bataan. Americans gave ground. Americans surrendered. The record was there. They were reading the right data. They were asking the wrong question. That same month at Noumea, 400 miles south of Guadalcanal, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner was sitting at a metal desk in a converted office, reading the same intelligence reports everyone else was reading, this time about Japanese night-fighting capability. The report described their training programs, their equipment, their tactical doctrine for surface engagements after dark. Turner read through it once, then went back to one paragraph and read it again. He underlined a single sentence, wrote 3 words in the margin in pencil. "We have not." He didn't call a meeting, didn't issue a directive, just underlined the sentence, folded the report, and put it in the top drawer of his desk where he would see it every morning. 14 days later, his supply ships were heading back to Guadalcanal. Trucatol, August 16, 1942. The briefing room was hot, even at 8 in the morning. Officers sat in rows in front of a map of Guadalcanal, tacked to a wooden board. The intelligence officer read from his notes. Between 2,000 and 10,000 Marines were holding the Lunga perimeter. The airfield was operational. The Americans had radar. Orders from 17th Army Command were explicit. Reconnaissance first, no direct assault. Wait for the second echelon of the regiment to arrive before committing. Ichiki sat in the front row. He listened to all of it. He packed 7 days of rations for his men. Not because supplies were short. There was more available. 7 days because he had looked at the map, calculated the march time, added a day, and decided that was sufficient. A man who plans for contingencies is a man who expects to need them. Ichiki did not expect to need them. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers ran at full speed through the darkness and put 917 men ashore at Taivu Point. The landing was clean. No contact. The men assembled on the beach in less than an hour, checked their equipment, and moved into the tree line. Ichiki left 100 men at Taivu as rear guard. He led the remaining 800 west along the coast toward Henderson Field, 22 miles away. He didn't wait for the second echelon. The order to wait had been given by officers who, in Ichiki's judgment, did not fully understand the situation on the ground. He understood it. The Americans were demoralized from the Savo Island defeat. They were isolated. They were weak. One hard push in the night, and Henderson Field would fall before the second echelon was even needed. 2 miles into the march, his advance scouts made contact with an American patrol. A short firefight. The scouts took casualties and pulled back to report. Ichiki received the report while still moving. He kept moving. He radioed Rabaul. No enemy presence, like marching through empty land. What Ichiki had no way of knowing. 8 days before he landed at Taivu Point, a radio intercept station in Hawaii, Station Hypo, the same team that had broken Japanese naval codes before Midway, had decrypted a signal connecting his name to Destroyer Squadron 2 and the word Guadalcanal. The decrypt reached Vandegrift's intelligence officer on August 10th. They had 9 days to prepare. The Marine line at the Ilu River had been reinforced, pre-sighted, and waiting. When Ichiki's scouts made contact with that American patrol 2 miles from the perimeter, they hadn't stumbled onto a random outpost. They had found the forward edge of a trap that had been built specifically for them. Ichiki's radio report, like marching through empty land, went out at 11:30 at night. The Marines on the Ilu River line could hear the Japanese column moving through the jungle toward them. They had been in their fighting positions for hours. Some of them had been waiting since sundown. Before dawn on August 21st, right on the schedule written in the diary, Ichiki attacked. No artillery preparation, no reconnaissance of the wire. 800 men running across open white sand in the darkness toward a defensive line they had never seen. Correspondent Richard Tregaskis was embedded with the Marines that night. He wrote in his notebook later, "We heard them before we saw them. They were making noise, shouting even. They weren't trying to be quiet." The machine guns on both flanks opened simultaneously. The first wave broke on the barbed wire. Men piled into it, tangled, fell. The ones behind them pushed forward into the same wire. The guns kept firing. Ichiki sent a second wave into the same gap, then a third. At first light, Vandegrift sent tanks and a full battalion into the coconut grove east of the Ilu, behind what remained of Ichiki's force. The survivors had pulled back into the tree line and had no route out. The grove was dense, the undergrowth chest-high, the ground soft. The tanks moved slowly and methodically. 789 of 917 men died on Guadalcanal that day and night. Ichiki burned his regimental colors in the grove. Then he died. Accounts differ on whether by his own hand in the final minutes or in the fighting itself. Either way, he did not survive the morning. The Marines who walked the beach afterward were mostly quiet. One corporal, interviewed later, said only, "They ain't supermen. They're just tricky bastards." Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison wrote the same thing more formally, that the battle had proven, for the first time, that American Marines could fight Japanese veterans in the jungle and win. At Rabaul, General Hyakutake received the report and sent a single line to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The attack of the Ichiki detachment was not entirely successful. The question raised in the operations room was not, "How well can the Marines fight?" It was, "Did Ichiki have enough men?" Hyakutake opened his desk drawer, pulled out Kawaguchi's file. At Numea, Turner sat across from his chief of staff and went through his notebook page by page, everything he had done wrong at Savo Island. The miscommunication with the screening force, the failure to establish clear command responsibilities, the 8 hours it had taken him to receive a reconnaissance report that should have reached him in 2. He gave the list to his staff and told them to read it. 15 days after Savo, his transports were back in the waters around Guadalcanal. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi read the Ichiki after-action report carefully. He was methodical by nature, a career officer who had fought in China and Borneo, who understood that battles were won through planning and not just willpower. He underlined 2 words in the report: frontal assault. His analysis: Ichiki had attacked the wrong way, across the wrong terrain with insufficient force. The beach approach was suicide against a prepared defense. The answer was the jungle, terrain the Americans hadn't fortified, couldn't see into, and couldn't cover with interlocking fire. Go around, go through. Hit from a direction they weren't watching. He was right about the tactics. He was completely wrong about what was waiting for him. Before he shipped out, Kawaguchi packed his dress-white uniform, the formal attire worn by Japanese officers at surrender ceremonies. He intended to be wearing it when Vandegrift signed the document handing over Guadalcanal. Marine raiders hit his supply depot at Tazimboko 2 days before his main attack. They found the uniform. They took it. Kawaguchi landed 6,000 men on Guadalcanal in late August and early September. He spent 2 weeks planning a 3-pronged assault on Henderson Field from the south and east, the jungle approach that Ichiki had never considered. He was confident. He had 3 times the force Ichiki had brought. He had artillery. He had a plan that was tactically sound, that learned from what had gone wrong before. He offered to accept an additional battalion from Hyakutake. Then he shook his head and turned it down. Not necessary. I'll be done in one night. The jungle did what Guadalcanal's jungle always did, to carefully made schedules. The three columns got separated almost immediately. Communication between them relied on runners who got lost in terrain that had no trails, no landmarks, and no reliable way to navigate in darkness. Units that were supposed to arrive at their jump-off positions simultaneously arrived hours apart. The march that was supposed to take 2 days took 3. Kawaguchi pushed forward anyway. There was no contingency plan. The attack would happen when it happened. The coordination would work itself out. On the night of September 12th, his main force came up the long grassy slope of the ridge south of Henderson Field. The ground was open here, the grass waist-high, the night black and wet. Marine foxholes lined the crest. Fewer than 800 raiders and paratroopers held the entire position. Kawaguchi had nearly 3,000 men on that slope. For 2 nights, his troops attacked in waves up the ridge. Each wave reached the crest in different places and at different times. Never enough men in one place at one moment to break through completely. The Marines shifted their reserves from point to point along the line, plugging gaps as they opened, giving ground, and taking it back. At 3 a.m. on September 13th, Kawaguchi was positioned below the crest, listening to the sounds of the battle above him. The firing was intense. His men were clearly in contact. He believed, had to believe, from everything he could hear, that the line had finally broken. He radioed his flanking units, press the attack. What he couldn't see, 300 yards up the slope in the rain and the dark, was Edson walking the Marine line in both directions, stopping at each foxhole, looking each man in the face, his voice completely level. This is it. There is no better place to die. The line held. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi was leading what remained of his brigade on a 5-day march west through the same jungle they had come through. They left more than 850 dead on the ridge. The survivors were malnourished, many had malaria, and they had no food for the march. He sat down that night and wrote his after-action report. He did not blame the terrain. He did not blame the weather. He did not write that his men had lacked spirit or that the plan had been sound in principle. He wrote that the American Marines had fought with a skill, discipline, and determination that exceeded anything Japanese intelligence had predicted, that the fundamental assumptions about American fighting ability needed to be revised before any further operations were planned. It was the first time any Japanese officer had put those words in an official document. He was relieved of command. His report was classified, filed, not distributed to any officer planning the next operation. Hyakutake never read it, not because anyone stopped him, but because in the system he operated in, a report that challenged the fundamental assumptions about the enemy did not travel upward. It disappeared. If you think this story deserves to be heard, the like button is right there. 1 second. It's how this reaches the people who've never heard the name Guadalcanal. At Noumea, Turner stayed aboard until the last crate was unloaded, then went below. No record of what he said. Only this: he added 1 line to his notebook before he slept. General Hyakutake stood before his assembled officers on Guadalcanal on October 22, 1942, with more than 20,000 Japanese troops on the island, and said, "The time of the decisive battle between Japan and the United States has come." He had already assigned members of his staff to begin planning the surrender ceremony, the precise location, the sequence of events, which American officers would be present, how the formal document would be worded. He wanted it conducted with such precision and dignity that it would be spoken of throughout the Japanese army for years. The date of the attack on Henderson Field had been set for October 22nd, then pushed to the 23rd because Maruyama's force hadn't reached its position, then pushed again to the 24th. Hyakutake postponed the date. He did not revise the plan. A Japanese soldier captured near the perimeter that week was asked by a Marine intelligence officer why the attack hadn't been modified when conditions on the ground made the original concept unworkable. The prisoner sat quietly for a moment, then said, "The plan had been made. No one would have dared to change it. It must go as it is written. 20,000 men, heavy artillery, tanks, 2 simultaneous attacks designed to hit Henderson Field from multiple directions at once and overwhelm the defenders before they could shift reserves. Northern thrust, General Sumiyoshi with 5 battalions along the coast road. A diversion to fix the Marines in place and draw attention away from the main effort. Southern thrust, General Maruyama leading 7,000 men of the 2nd Sendai Division through the jungle south of Henderson Field. 15 miles of the worst terrain on the island. No trails. Rivers and ravines not shown on any map. Ridge lines that ran in every direction except the one you needed. The plan was elegant on paper. The paper did not include Guadalcanal's jungle. The march south took 10 days to cover 15 miles. Maruyama's men moved through terrain that swallowed men whole. Not jungle in the way anyone had imagined it, but a maze of razor-edged kunai grass, taller than a man's head, ravines that appeared without warning, rivers with no banks, mud that pulled at boots until the boots came off. Every artillery piece required 30 men to carry it. Dozens were abandoned, not because the men gave up, but because the math stopped working. Too much weight, too little time. The attack date moved to the 23rd, then the 24th. Hyakutake notified his commanders each time. He did not change the plan. On the night of October 23rd, Sumiyoshi's artillery opened up on schedule, the original schedule before either postponement. Tank engines started in the darkness along the coast road. The northern diversionary attack went forward as planned. Maruyama's force was still in the jungle. He wouldn't reach his position for another 24 hours. The 2 prongs of the attack that were designed to strike simultaneously struck 24 hours apart. The Marines dealt with Sumiyoshi's tanks on the coast road that night. 9 or 10 Type 97s coming in column, stopped by a 37mm anti-tank gun that had been dug in for exactly that purpose. One by one. When Maruyama's men finally reached the southern perimeter the following night, the Marines on the coast road had already stood down and gone back to their positions. Private First Class Mitchell Page, a machine gunner on the southern perimeter, was still at his weapon at 3 in the morning when the men on either side of him were dead or wounded. He kept firing. When the gun jammed, he cleared it. When it jammed again, he pulled a dead man's rifle and kept going. Sergeant John Basilone had 2 water-cooled M1917 machine guns further along the line. When ammunition ran out at one gun, he carried cases through the dark under fire. He burned his hands on barrels that had overheated past any safe temperature. He kept both guns running through the night. At 3 in the morning, a radio message from Maruyama reached Hyakutake's command post. Airfield perimeter broken through. The perimeter hadn't been broken through. Maruyama, in the darkness and confusion of a firefight that stretched across hundreds of meters of jungle, believed what he needed to believe. His men were at the wire. They were through the wire in some places. That was close enough to report as a breakthrough. When daylight came, he could see what had actually happened. 941 Japanese soldiers were counted dead on the southern approach. General Nasu, who had led the first wave, was among them. The line had bent in places. It had not broken. Hyakutake sat in his command tent for 3 hours after the final reports came in. There are no records of what was said in that tent, or whether anything was said at all. His staff waited outside. Nobody went in. Then he emerged and dictated the cable to Tokyo. The cable acknowledged that the attack on Henderson Field had not succeeded. It cited difficult terrain and adverse weather conditions as contributing factors. It did not mention the Marines by name. It did not use the word failure. It did not contain a single sentence that Kawaguchi's classified report, sitting in a filing cabinet at Rabaul that Hyakutake had never opened, hadn't already explained in precise detail 6 weeks earlier. Turner, December 1942. The Americal Division came ashore on Guadalcanal in daylight to relieve the 1st Marine Division. Clean landing. No attack during the approach. No ships lost. The first major reinforcement in the entire campaign that had arrived without casualties. 3 images. No commentary required. Ichiki wrote a victory schedule in his diary before he ever set foot on the island. Kawaguchi wrote the truth in his after-action report. Was relieved. His report was locked away and never distributed. Hyakutake blamed terrain and weather in his cable to Tokyo. He had been on the island. He had seen what happened. He wrote what the system would accept. After the evacuation in February 1943, when the senior Army and Navy commanders at Imperial General Headquarters finally sat down to understand what had gone wrong at Guadalcanal, one of them said, in an internal meeting, not for publication, what Kawaguchi had already written 14 months earlier. We misjudged the enemy at every level. Kawaguchi's report had said exactly that. Filed. Classified. Never read. The system hadn't hidden the truth from its generals deliberately. It had no mechanism for transmitting information that contradicted its foundational assumptions. The report existed. The filing cabinet existed. The lock on the cabinet was not a conspiracy. It was bureaucratic procedure applied uniformly to documents that challenged official doctrine. Hyakutake could not have read it, not because anyone stopped him, because in the system he operated in, a document that said, "We were wrong about our enemy," was not a document that moved upward. It was a document that disappeared. 3 generals, 1 answer, 0 transmissions. February 7th, 1943. The last Japanese soldiers left Guadalcanal in the darkness before dawn, wading out to destroyers waiting offshore. They left behind their dead, their equipment, their artillery pieces still pointed at Henderson Field. American intelligence, watching the destroyers approach the island in convoy, initially classified the movement as a reinforcement operation. It looked exactly like the Tokyo Express runs that had been coming for 6 months. By the time the truth was confirmed, the ships were already gone. In an emergency session at Imperial General Headquarters, a staff officer read aloud from a damage assessment. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then the Army Chief of Staff said, "Guadalcanal may develop into the decisive battle of this war." It already had. They were 6 months late in understanding it. At Noumea, Turner was already at his desk with the maps for New Georgia spread open in front of him. Same desk, same pencil. The Savo Island notebook was in the drawer, more worn now, the cover softened from being handled. He had stopped thinking of Savo as a defeat sometime around November. He thought of it the way a surgeon thinks of a patient who died on the table in the first year of training, not as a failure to be buried, but as a case to be understood completely, so it never happened the same way again. He called it the first time we learned how to fight. The road from Guadalcanal to Tokyo ran through New Georgia, through Bougainville, through the Marianas, through Iwo Jima, through Okinawa. Turner was at every one of them. He was still learning at every one of them. On the morning of September 14th, after Kawaguchi's force had pulled back from Edson's Ridge, a Marine walked the crest and counted the Japanese dead on the slope below. He stopped counting at 400. There were more. He had been on the island for 38 days. He was 19 years old. He sat down on the grass at the top of the ridge, looked out at Henderson Field below, the runway still intact, the aircraft still there, and didn't say anything. Nobody who was there that morning recorded what the silence felt like, but every man who survived it carried it with them. 3 generals came to that island with the same certainty, and left, those who left, with the same confusion. Not, why did we lose? The question they couldn't ask was simpler and more devastating than that. Were we wrong about who we were fighting? Ichiki couldn't ask it. It never occurred to him that he needed to. Kawaguchi asked it, wrote the answer down, and was removed from command. Hyakutake arrived with a surrender ceremony already planned and left the island without one. The question that could have changed everything was answered on that island, in the jungle, and on the ridge lines, by the men who held the line. They didn't need to ask it. A lot of you grew up hearing pieces of this history, not from textbooks, from the dinner table. A grandfather who would go quiet for a moment, then say one sentence about an island, about a friend, about a night he never talked about otherwise. Those stories aren't in any archive. They don't exist anywhere except in the people who were told them. Leave one here, even just a sentence. We want to hear them. August 19th, 1942. Guadalcanal. Captain Charles Brush led 60 Marines out of the wire before dawn and turned east along the coast road. His orders were straightforward. A Japanese radio station had been reported near Taivu Point. Find it, destroy it, come back. What he found instead, moving through the heat of midday, was a Japanese patrol, about 35 men, no point man out front, no spacing between them, no formation at all. They were walking like men who had nowhere particular to be. Brush flanked them. The whole thing was over in less than an hour. 31 Japanese soldiers dead, 3 Marines killed. When Brush's men went through the bodies, they pulled out documents, maps mostly. Brush could not read Japanese. He didn't need to. The positions on those maps were American positions. Every one of them. He said later, the maps were so accurate they startled him. So, that was where things stood in August of 1942. The Japanese knew where the Marines were. The Marines knew roughly where the Japanese were. Both sides were moving through the same jungle, watching the same ridgelines, running patrols down the same dark trails. That was August. By October, something had changed. The Japanese were still in that jungle, still moving, still running patrols. But they had stopped getting the information they needed, not because the jungle changed, not because the Marines built a wall, because a man no one outside the 1st Marine Division had ever heard of spent a few weeks in September and into October building something that had never existed before in the history of the United States Marine Corps. His name was Colonel William J. Whaling. He was not a graduate of the Naval Academy. He was not from a military family. William Whaling was born on February 26, 1894, in St. Cloud, Minnesota, the son of Canadian immigrants. His father was not a soldier. There was nothing about his early life that pointed toward what he would eventually become. In May of 1917, he walked into a Marine Corps recruiting station and enlisted as a private, not an officer candidate, not a commissioned gentleman, a private. He shipped to France with the 6th Marines, 2nd Division, and went into the trenches in the Verdun sector in March 1918. Then came Belleau Wood in June, 3 weeks of some of the worst fighting of the war, in a patch of French woodland that changed hands 19 times before it was over. Whaling was gassed there, not wounded by shrapnel or a bullet, gassed. He spent the next 2 months in a hospital. The commission came while he was recovering. Second Lieutenant, August 1918. When he was well enough to return to the regiment, the war still had 3 months left in it. He went into the Saint-Mihiel offensive in September, fighting near Thiaucourt, where he distinguished himself well enough that the Marine Corps gave him a Silver Star for it. He was 24 years old. He had been in uniform for less than 2 years. He had already been gassed at Belleau Wood, promoted on a hospital bed, and decorated in the field at Saint-Mihiel. The armistice came before he could add anything else to that record. After the war, the Marine Corps kept him. In 1924, they sent him to Paris, not for the peace negotiations, for the Olympics. Whaling had spent 7 years making himself one of the best pistol shooters in the United States military, which at that time meant one of the best in the world. The 1924 Summer Olympics included a rapid-fire pistol competition, 25 meters, targets that gave you seconds to acquire and fire. 55 competitors from 17 nations. Whaling finished 12th. His American teammate, Gunnery Sergeant Henry Bailey, won the gold. Both of them were United States Marines. The years between Paris and Guadalcanal were not quiet years. They were instructional. China, Nicaragua, Haiti. Small places with big jungles and no clear front lines, where the man who understood terrain survived and the man who didn't became a story, told to the next generation of officers. Whaling did not write about what he learned in those years. There was no paper trail of personal philosophy, no manual with his name on it. What he carried was simpler than that. He knew how a man moved through dense vegetation without announcing himself. He knew how to read a tree line the way other men read a page, not for what it showed, but for what it was hiding. He knew that the jungle was not an obstacle. It was a condition, and conditions could be used. In 1941, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned as executive officer of the 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division. On May 21, 1942, he was made a full colonel. On August 7, 1942, he went ashore on Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division in the summer of 1942 was not a division with a surplus of experienced jungle fighters. Most of these men had trained in the United States on ranges and parade grounds. Some had served in China or the Caribbean, but the majority had never spent a month in a tropical jungle with a determined enemy, trying to kill them from positions they could not see. The Japanese they were fighting had no such inexperience. Japan's army had been at war in China since 1937, 5 years. Its soldiers had been moving through difficult terrain against armed opponents for longer than most of the Marines on Guadalcanal had been in uniform. An Australian general, writing a formal assessment in September of 1942 about why his forces were struggling against Japanese troops in New Guinea, listed near the top of his findings a single sentence that said everything. Higher standard of training of enemy in jungle warfare. That was not a small gap to close. On September 25, 1942, Whaling was relieved of his position in the 5th Marines. The reasons were internal, having to do with the division's assessment of the regiment's command structure. Whaling was not sent home. Colonel Gerald Thomas, the divisional chief of staff, intervened and kept him on the island. Whaling had no assignment. He asked Thomas for one. What he proposed was not a combat unit in any conventional sense. He wanted volunteers, enough to form a working detachment, and permission to train them for something the Marine Corps had never formally done before. Close patrolling, not reconnaissance in the broad sense, something more specific. Moving into terrain the enemy believed he controlled, locating exactly what was there, and disappearing before anyone knew you had been. Thomas brought the proposal to General Vandegrift. Vandegrift said yes. The men Whaling chose were not selected for size or speed or scores on standard fitness evaluations. He wanted to know where a man grew up. He wanted to know if the man had spent time outdoors before the war, not camping, not day hikes, but real time in terrain, hunting, trapping, work that required patience and stillness and the ability to read the small things that most people look at without seeing. Appalachia sent him men. The rural South sent him men. The Plain States sent him men. These were Americans who had grown up in a world where the difference between a deer that bolted and a deer that didn't was the direction of the wind 3 minutes before you raised your rifle. They did not need to be taught to be quiet. They needed to be taught to do what they already knew how to do in a jungle instead of a forest. Whaling set up school on Guadalcanal itself. There was no time and nowhere else to do it. He taught stalking, the specific discipline of moving toward a position without triggering the animal awareness that every human being carries in the back of his skull. He taught camouflage not as face paint and foliage, but as the deliberate removal of yourself from the picture a trained eye would scan. And he taught the one rule that everything else depended on. You do not fire from the same position twice. One shot, then you move. You are somewhere else before the sound finishes traveling. The Japanese could track a muzzle flash. They could triangulate a report. Given enough time, they could fix a position and put fire on it. Whaling was not going to give them time. There was one more element that no planning document had anticipated. The Solomon Islands had been home to people for thousands of years before the Japanese or the Americans arrived. Those people knew this jungle the way Whaling's men knew their home counties, not from maps, but from a lifetime of moving through it. Martin Clemens, a British coast watcher who had been on Guadalcanal since before the Marines landed, had already built a network of local scouts. Vandegrift had been using them since August. Their intelligence had saved American positions more than once. Whaling folded them into his group. They did not just show his men the trails. They taught them how to listen to a jungle, what it sounded like when nothing was wrong, and what it sounded like when something was. That distinction, which takes years to develop, is not something you can put in a training manual. You can only learn it from someone who already knows it. By early October, the Whaling group was ready. The Japanese west of the Meticulously River did not know it existed. That was about to matter. The Meticulously River runs roughly north to south before it empties into the sea on the northwest edge of the marine perimeter. In the first weeks of October 1942, the Japanese were west of that river. That was the line. East of the Meticulously, Marines. West of the Meticulously, a Japanese force that had been rebuilding since the failed attacks of September, absorbing new men, new ammunition, new artillery pieces that had come ashore through the Tokyo Express night runs. General Maruyama's infantry, General Nasu's 4th Infantry Regiment, fresh troops, not the exhausted remnants of Kawaguchi's brigade, men who had not yet lost. Vandegrift needed to know what was over there. Not a general estimate, not a guess based on radio intercepts and Coast Watcher reports. He needed eyes across that river. Accurate, current information about exactly where the Japanese were building and exactly how many of them there were. He sent Whaling. The Meticulously had one crossing that both sides knew about. A single log bridge, maybe 4 feet wide. The kind of thing that took one man at a time and put him fully exposed for every step of the crossing. The Japanese had a guard post on the western bank. Anyone trying to use that bridge was going to announce himself before he got halfway across. That was the obvious crossing. Whaling was not interested in the obvious crossing. On the morning of October 7th, the Solomon Islands scouts moved ahead of the main group, working upstream along the eastern bank. They were not reading terrain from a map. They were reading it the way they had read it their entire lives, by what the water sounded like, by the way the undergrowth thinned or thickened, by marks on the bank that a man trained in a different part of the world would have walked past without noticing. 200 yards upstream from the log bridge, they found what they were looking for: a crossing point. Narrow, shallow enough to wade, and unguarded. The Japanese were watching the bridge. They were not watching everything else. Whaling moved his men across before the guard post on the bridge knew they were gone. They flanked west and south, moving through terrain the Japanese garrison believed it controlled. The whaling group did not announce itself. It did not fix a position and open fire. It moved, and it kept moving, placing men where they needed to be, pulling the net tighter with every hour. By the morning of October 8th, Whaling's force had linked up with the 5th Marines, pushing from the south. The Japanese units west of the Meticulously, elements of the 4th Infantry Regiment, approximately 750 men, were enclosed on 3 sides. The river was at their backs. The jungle they had trusted to protect them had produced an enemy from inside it. It was a closing. 750 Japanese soldiers were killed, not routed, not captured. Killed. The after-action numbers were precise enough that the Marine Corps counted them. Vandegrift's official report on the Meticulously operations described Whaling's contribution to the reconnaissance and movement as, in his exact words, immeasurable. That word, immeasurable, appeared later in the formal commendation attached to Whaling's award citation, entered into the Bureau of Naval Personnel records. It was not a decoration given for a specific moment of bravery. It was given for something harder to quantify and harder to teach: the ability to move a force through terrain the enemy owned and deliver it to exactly the right place at exactly the right time, without the enemy knowing it had happened until the trap was already closed. There is a photograph that still exists from this period. Colonel Whaling in the lower left of the frame, looking down at a map spread on the ground, other officers gathered around him. Guadalcanal, 1942. He does not look like the popular image of a combat officer. He is not standing at a command post gesturing at a radio. He is on the ground, in the jungle, reading a map the same way he had been reading terrain since France. That photograph was taken before Meticulously. After Meticulously, the Japanese commanders west of the river had to explain to their superiors in Rabaul what had happened to 750 men. The Japanese response to contact was trained and disciplined. Identify the source, suppress it, flank it, destroy it. This is how armies operate. This is how they are taught. When fire comes from a fixed position, there is a sequence of actions that neutralizes it. Every trained soldier in the Pacific in 1942, American or Japanese, had that sequence in his muscle memory. But you cannot flank a position that is already empty. Japanese patrols sent to locate the source of fire found nothing. Not disturbed vegetation, not brass casings in an obvious cluster, not the compressed earth of a shooter's prone position held for hours. The scouts of the whaling group had been taught by men who had spent their lives leaving no evidence of their passing. They had been taught by the Solomon Islanders, who had been moving through this specific jungle for generations. By the second week of October, Japanese officers west of the Meticulously were filing reports that described a problem they did not have language for. Patrols were making contact and losing track of where the contact came from. Snipers were engaging outposts and vanishing. Positions identified by sound could not be confirmed by any subsequent search. The men they were looking for were Americans from Kentucky and Georgia and the Carolina Mountains and the flat grasslands of the Plains states, men who had grown up with rifles before the Marine Corps ever touched them, and who had been trained in a few weeks of jungle schooling by a colonel who had spent his entire career accumulating knowledge that could not be put in a manual. They were not ghosts. They were just men who understood that the jungle does not hide you. You have to disappear into it. And once you know how, The man looking for you will spend hours searching the place you used to be. There is a September 6th intelligence report on file from the Guadalcanal campaign, signed by Colonel Clifton Cates, commander of the 1st Marines. It describes Japanese officers observed during patrols. All of them, Cates noted, were carrying swords and automatic pistols. That was September. They were still wearing rank, still carrying the visible marks of command, the sword that told every man in the formation who gave the orders, the posture that said the same thing without a word. By October, after Matinicao, they had stopped, not because anyone told them to, because enough of them had gone down in the wrong moment, in the wrong clearing, at a distance that shouldn't have been lethal, that the men who were still alive had drawn the only logical conclusion available. Someone was choosing them specifically. Whaling had built this into the training from the beginning, not as a rule written in a manual, as an understanding passed from one man to the next during the weeks of instruction in September and into October. The logic was simple enough that it didn't require much explanation. An army without soldiers is still an army. It still has weapons, ammunition, defensive positions, the ability to move and fire. An army without officers is something else. It is a body without a nervous system, capable of individual action, capable of reflexes, but no longer capable of coordinated response. It cannot adapt. It cannot redirect. It can only do what it was doing when the orders stopped coming. Whaling's men were not told to count kills. They were told to think about what a single shot, placed correctly, could do to a formation's ability to function. The answer, in a jungle where visibility was under 20 feet and reaction time was everything, was considerable. The Japanese officers who survived October on Guadalcanal learned to move differently. They removed their rank insignia before leaving the perimeter. They dressed like their enlisted men. They did not stand at the front of formations, did not gesture at terrain features with their arms extended, did not do any of the things that an officer does naturally and automatically when he is directing men in the field. It didn't fully work. Because rank insignia was never the tell was behavior. The tell was the slight pause that went through a column when a specific man stopped moving. The tell was the way a dozen heads turned toward one person when an unexpected sound came out of the tree line. The tell was the space that formed naturally around a man whose loss would matter most. Whaling's men had been taught to watch for all of it. Lieutenant William White, the intelligence officer attached to the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, Princeton class of 1939, on Guadalcanal since the first day, wrote about what patrolling felt like in practice during that period. He was not a man given to dramatizing. He was an intelligence officer. His job was to observe accurately, report precisely, and let the facts carry their own weight. He described moving through Point Cruz with his scouts. They heard a sound that someone mistook for a friendly signal. A whistle. It wasn't a whistle. He wrote, "Those were bullets, and some of them must have killed my friend Ramrod." White survived Guadalcanal. Ramrod did not. This was not a clean operation with clear lines between hunter and hunted. The whaling group operated inside a jungle where the Japanese had been for months, knew every trail, and were actively trying to do to the Marines exactly what the Marines were trying to do to them. Men died on both sides of that equation. The difference between them was not courage. Both sides had courage in quantities that are difficult to comprehend from a distance of 80 years. The difference was what happened in the seconds after contact. A Japanese patrol that made contact could report a position. By the time anything could be done with that information, the position was empty. A whaling group patrol that made contact was already somewhere else before the report was written. After the war, American translation teams worked through the diaries recovered from Japanese dead on the Pacific Islands. Not the dispatches of generals, not the operational orders of field commanders. The personal notebooks carried by ordinary soldiers, privates, corporals, junior officers, the people who write not to inform anyone else, but to make sense of what they are living through. The diaries from Guadalcanal had a quality that researchers noted was distinct from those recovered at other campaigns. Lieutenant Genjiro Inui of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company had come ashore on August 30th, 1942. He kept a diary throughout the campaign and published his account after the war under the title My Guadalcanal. He was a trained officer. He had served before Guadalcanal. He had experienced combat before Guadalcanal. He wrote that his unit moved along the beach rather than through the jungle, not because the beach was safer. American destroyers ran the coast regularly. Naval gunfire was a real threat on any exposed shoreline. A man on a beach under shell fire has no cover. A man in the jungle, in theory, has all the cover in the world. He moved along the beach because in the jungle, he wrote, you could not tell what direction anything was coming from. He wrote it as a practical observation, not an admission of fear, not a complaint, a statement of operational fact, the way a man describes the properties of terrain he has learned to work around. He made a calculation: open ground and naval gunfire on one side, jungle, and something he had no name for on the other. And he chose the side with the shells. He had been on the island for weeks before he wrote it. Whatever he had seen or heard or lost in those weeks, he did not elaborate. He didn't need to. Researcher Aaron William Moore examined the vocabulary patterns in Japanese wartime diaries across multiple Pacific campaigns. In the Guadalcanal diaries, he found one word appearing with unusual frequency in entries from October onward: kakugo. In Japanese military culture, kakugo carries a specific weight. It means readiness, but not the readiness of a man preparing to do something he has trained for. It is the readiness of a man who has accepted that the outcome is no longer in his control. It appears in accounts of men preparing for banzai charges, for suicide missions, for final stands with no reinforcement coming. On Guadalcanal, in October 1942, kakugo was appearing in diary entries written before men left the perimeter during daylight. Not before an attack, before a patrol, before walking into the jungle in the afternoon. These men were preparing themselves in the same way they would prepare for a final charge, for the possibility that they would not come back from an ordinary patrol. Not because they were going into a known battle, but because the jungle itself had become the thing that could not be predicted. Something inside it fired and moved and left nothing behind. Something inside it selected specific men for specific reasons. Something inside it could not be found, could not be fixed, could not be countered by the 5 years of jungle warfare experience that these soldiers carried. They wrote kakugo and walked out anyway. That is not a small thing. On December 9th, 1942, the 1st Marine Division was relieved on Guadalcanal. They went to Australia. Nearly 3,000 casualties in 4 months. Malaria had put more men out of action than bullets had. The men who came off that island were thin in ways that photographs from that period make plain, hollowed out by heat and disease, and months of fighting in terrain that never let them rest. They rested. They reorganized. In February 1943, the 1st Marine Division stood up the first formal scout sniper platoons in the history of the United States Marine Corps. The man who designed the training program was 1st Lieutenant Holly White, the same intelligence officer who had been on Guadalcanal since August 7th, who had walked the trails around Point Cruz, who had lost Ramrod to a bullet someone thought was a signal. He had spent 4 months watching what worked and what didn't. He had seen whaling's methods produce results that the standard playbook couldn't explain. He knew exactly what had worked. He wrote it down this time. Those platoons went to Tarawa, to Saipan, to Peleliu, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa. Every island the Marine Corps fought for in the remaining 3 years of the Pacific War. They fought with men trained in the doctrine first practiced in the jungle west of the Meticulously in October 1942. The Japanese total on Guadalcanal, when the numbers were finally compiled, more than 24,000 dead, roughly 7,000 in direct combat, the remainder from starvation and disease after the supply lines that ran through the jungle at night collapsed under the weight of an enemy that owned the daylight hours in terrain the Japanese had believed, with good reason, was theirs. In August 1942, before the whaling group existed, before Matanikau, before any of it, General Vandegrift wrote a letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Thomas Holcomb. He was writing about the Marines who had fought at the Ilu River, the ones who had stopped Ichiki. He wrote, "These youngsters, once they get started, are the most vicious fighters I have ever seen." He meant it as praise. He had watched them fight. What he did not know, on the day he wrote that letter, was that a colonel with no current assignment was sitting somewhere on that same island, thinking about volunteers and a jungle that most men were still treating as an obstacle. Vandegrift's Marines were vicious. What whaling made them was something the Japanese had no category for. Not louder, not faster, not more aggressive, quieter, present without appearing, gone before anyone could say where they had been. The Japanese spent 4 months on Guadalcanal trying to find them in that jungle. They never did. In 1992, Robert Ballard sent a camera down into the darkness northwest of Savo Island. 800 feet down, then 1,000, then 2,000, and then there she was. The bow of USS Laffey, sitting upright on the sea floor, exactly as she had settled on the night of November 13th, 1942. Her forward guns still trained to port, still pointed at the last target she ever fired on. Nobody moved them. Nobody ever could. Ballard had found the Titanic 7 years before that. He'd mapped the ocean floor from the Arctic to the Pacific. But he said later that nothing quite prepared him for what he found in that patch of water between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. Because the Laffey wasn't alone. Scattered across that sea floor, layered on top of each other in some places, were the remains of dozens of warships, American destroyers, Japanese battleships, an Australian heavy cruiser. Some of them had never been found. Some of them, nobody was even sure exactly where they went down. The people who live on those islands today, the Solomon Islanders, they don't swim here. They call it the Deadwater. The U.S. Navy has a different name, Ironbottom Sound. And here is what happened in this place. In the space of 3 months, August, October, November 1942, Japan sent 3 of its greatest admirals down into these waters. Each one had been hand-picked by Yamamoto himself. Each one won his battle that night, and every single one of them failed the same way. Their names were Mikawa, Abe, and Kondo. This is their story, and the story of the ships down there. Now, if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you already know Henderson Field. You know what it was. You know why it mattered. You know that as long as those planes kept flying off that runway, no Japanese ship could move through these waters in daylight without paying for it. So I'm not going to walk you through that again. What I want to talk about instead is something different. Something that I think gets lost in almost every telling of this story. Japan knew. Yamamoto was not a naive man. He had spent 2 years in the United States. He'd studied at Harvard. He'd watched American shipyards the way a chess player watches his opponent's hands. He knew what this country could build, and how fast it could build it, in a way that very few men in Tokyo truly understood. And by the fall of 1942, he was deeply, privately alarmed. In a letter to a fellow admiral, he didn't mince words. He wrote that the situation at Guadalcanal was, in his words, far more serious than anything Japan had faced since the siege of Port Arthur in the Russo-Japanese War. Port Arthur. If you know your history, you know what that comparison meant. Port Arthur was the defining crisis of that entire war, the siege that nearly broke Japan before it had barely begun. Yamamoto was telling his colleagues, "This is that bad. This is that serious." And yet, he kept sending ships. He kept sending men. He kept sending his best admirals down into that sound. The same sound he knew would swallow them if they weren't out before sunrise. Why? Because Japan was not losing a battle. Japan was losing a race. Every week that Henderson Field stayed open, American transports were delivering more men, more ammunition, more aviation fuel to Guadalcanal. Every month that passed, another Essex-class carrier was sliding off the ways at a shipyard in Newport News, or Quincy, or Puget Sound. America was building ships faster than Japan could sink them. Japan had no equivalent. They had no industrial reserve that deep. They had brilliant engineers and superbly trained crews and some of the finest warships ever built. But they did not have what America had, which was factory floor after factory floor, running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, turning out hulls and engines and guns as if the country itself had decided that losing simply was not acceptable. Yamamoto understood this better than anyone in Tokyo, and that understanding made his position impossible. He could not afford to wait. Every week he hesitated was a week the balance shifted further. Every night those planes flew off Henderson Field was another night. Japanese supply ships couldn't reach their starving soldiers on the island. There was no option that didn't carry an enormous cost. So he sent his admirals in, one after another, knowing the odds, knowing the trap, knowing the price. But here is the thing that nobody asked, and this is the part of this story that I think almost nobody talks about. What exactly were those admirals sent to do? The answer sounds simple. Get into Ironbottom Sound, shell Henderson Field, get out before dawn. One night, in and out, hit the airfield hard enough to put it out of commission, at least long enough for the troop convoys to land safely. That was the mission. And there's a detail buried right there in the middle of that mission, a detail so obvious that nobody in Tokyo seemed to notice it, that made failure almost inevitable before a single ship ever left Rabaul. They were each given one night to do something that, as it turned out, could not be done in one night. Henderson Field had been built to take a beating. It had been shelled before, bombed before. The Cactus Air Force, those pilots and crews living in tents in the mud and the heat, they had been patching that runway and pushing wrecked planes off the taxiway and getting back in the air since August. They knew how to absorb punishment and keep flying. One night of bombardment, even a heavy one, was not going to put that airfield out of commission permanently. Maybe for a few hours, maybe until the next afternoon, but not long enough, not nearly long enough, to change the strategic equation. To do that, you wouldn't need a raid. You'd need control. You'd need to own Ironbottom Sound, not for one night, but continuously. Long enough to starve the airfield of fuel and parts and replacement aircraft until it simply couldn't fight anymore. None of the 3 admirals were given that mission. None of them were asked whether the mission they were given was actually achievable. And not one of them, not Mikawa, not Abe, not Kondo, stood up in front of Yamamoto and said, "One night isn't enough. This won't work." That silence, that particular silence, is the thing that connects all 3 of them. That's where this story really begins. His name was Gunichi Mikawa, and before we talk about what he did wrong, we need to talk about what he did right. Because what he did right was one of the most extraordinary feats of seamanship in the entire Pacific War. Mikawa had graduated 3rd in his class at the Japanese Naval Academy at Itajima. He was not a man who coasted. He had read Alfred Thayer Mahon's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, the foundational text of modern naval strategy, 4 times. He had spent years as an instructor at the academy, then as chief of the instructional staff. He was a student of naval warfare in the deepest sense of the word. When Guadalcanal erupted in August 1942, Yamamoto looked at the officers available in the South Pacific and chose Mikawa to command the newly formed 8th Fleet at Rabaul. That was the most critical naval command in the entire Southern Theater. That tells you everything about what Yamamoto thought of this man. On the night of August 8th, Mikawa led 7 cruisers and a destroyer down through the channel they called the Slot, moving at speed, lights off, in the dark. The Allied fleet guarding the Guadalcanal anchorage had radar. They had more ships. They had been warned that morning by an Australian reconnaissance aircraft that a Japanese force was moving south. None of it mattered. The warning report sat in the wrong inbox. The radar operators were watching for aircraft, not surface ships. The fleet had been split into 3 separate groups covering different approaches, and nobody had issued a clear battle plan for the night. Mikawa's column sliced through all of it like a knife through paper. In 33 minutes, he sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers, the USS Astoria, the USS Quincy, the USS Vincennes, and the Australian HMAS Canberra. He damaged 2 more ships. He didn't lose a single vessel in the actual battle. The second worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy. Worse than anything since Pearl Harbor, 9 months before. Yamamoto sent a congratulatory telegram that same night. And then Mikawa did something that historians have been arguing about ever since. At 2:16 in the morning, with the Allied screening force destroyed or crippled and scattered, he called his staff together on the bridge of his flagship. In front of him, sitting in the anchorage just beyond where those 4 cruisers were now sinking, were the American transports. 16,000 Marines were still in the process of unloading. The supplies, the ammunition, the equipment that would let those men hold Guadalcanal for weeks and months. It was all still on those ships, or barely on the beach. Those transports were essentially defenseless. There was nothing left between Mikawa and them. He ordered his ships to withdraw. His reasoning was straightforward. By the time he regrouped and went after the transports, daylight would be dangerously close. And in daylight, American carrier aircraft would find him. His cruisers would be sitting ducks in open water, far from any air cover of their own. It was a reasonable calculation. It was also completely wrong. Because what Mikawa didn't know, what nobody on his staff knew, was that the American Carrier Task Force had already left. Admiral Fletcher, concerned about his own losses and worried about Japanese submarines, had pulled his carriers south hours earlier. By the time Mikawa was standing on that bridge weighing his options, there were no carrier aircraft waiting for him. The sky would have been empty. He was afraid of a threat that had already sailed away. 16,000 Marines finished unloading. 11 days later, Henderson Field was operational, and from that morning forward, every Japanese ship that entered Ironbottom Sound in daylight faced aircraft from the runway that Mikawa had been close enough to destroy, and hadn't. The Japanese historians who examined this campaign after the war were unsparing. One called it a turning point that Japan had handed to the Americans for free. Yamamoto praised the battle. History judged the decision. We'll come back to what that decision really meant. But first, I want to tell you about a man named Hiroaki Abe. Because 3 months after Savo Island, Yamamoto needed someone to finish what Mikawa hadn't started. He needed a battleship man. Before we get there, if you're finding this story worth your time, a like on this video genuinely helps, not for the number itself, but because it tells YouTube that this kind of history deserves a wider audience. I appreciate it. Hiroaki Abe was not a second choice. He was the commander of Battleship Division 11, the officer Yamamoto trusted with the most powerful surface combatants in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had fought at Midway, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz. By November 1942, he had more combat experience in this theater than almost any flag officer alive. And Yamamoto gave him something he hadn't given Mikawa. He gave him battleships, the Hiei and the Kirishima, Kongo-class fast battleships, 32,000 tons each, 14-inch guns that could throw a shell more than 20 miles, ships that had escorted the carriers at Pearl Harbor, ships that Japan could not afford to lose. The reasoning was sound. If the problem at Savo Island was that cruiser shells hadn't been heavy enough to permanently knock out Henderson Field, then send something heavier. Send something that couldn't be ignored. But here is the detail that changes everything about what happened next. When Abe's force left Truk on November 10th, the main batteries of the Hiei and the Kirishima were loaded with Type 3 shells. Incendiary fragmentation rounds, the kind of ammunition you use to destroy aircraft on a runway, fuel tanks, maintenance facilities, the kind of ammunition you load when your target is a shoreside installation and you are not expecting to fight another warship. Abe was going to shell an airfield. He was not, in his planning, going to fight a naval battle. He had not seriously prepared for the possibility that American warships would be waiting for him inside Ironbottom Sound in the dark. The night of November 12th was black and raining. Abe's force was moving south through heavy weather. Rain squalls breaking up the formation, ships losing visual contact with each other, the flagship struggling to maintain communication with its own screen. What Abe did not know was that Admiral Callahan had taken a force of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers into the Sound to stop him. Callahan didn't have battleships. He didn't have anything close to matching Abe's firepower on paper. What he had was determination and the willingness to close to point-blank range. So close that Abe's big guns would struggle to depress low enough to hit him. At 1:24 in the morning, the two fleets stumbled into each other in the darkness at a range of less than 5 miles. What followed was less a naval battle than a collision. Ships were firing in every direction. Destroyers were threading between battleships. The Helena's radar operator was calling out contacts faster than the flagship could process them. Callahan, trying to sort out who was who in the chaos, gave an order that has haunted naval historians ever since. Odd ships fire to starboard, even ships fire to port. In the confusion, some American ships briefly held fire to avoid hitting their own. In that same confusion, the USS San Francisco drove straight toward the Hiei. The two ships passed so close, within a few hundred yards, some accounts say closer, that Hiei's own guns couldn't depress far enough to hit her. San Francisco's crew fired everything they had into the Hiei's superstructure at point-blank range. And one of those shells found the Hiei's steering compartment. It flooded. The steering gear locked. A 32,000-ton battleship began to turn in a slow, helpless circle in the middle of Ironbottom Sound. Abe's men scrambled to switch from fragmentation rounds to armor-piercing. In the chaos of a close-quarters night battle, that took minutes, and in those minutes, San Francisco pulled clear. Callahan died that night. So did Rear Admiral Scott. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. It was, by any tactical measure, a Japanese victory. Abe had won the battle. At 2 a.m, Abe surveyed what he had. The Hiei, his flagship, was going in circles and could not be steered. His formation had scattered. The Kirishima was still combat-capable, and the path to Henderson Field was open. The American force had been shattered. He ordered the withdrawal. He cited the Hiei's condition. He cited uncertainty about how many American ships were still able to fight. He cited the approach of dawn. The reasoning, again, was not irrational. But Henderson Field was right there. The airfield that had been the entire reason for the mission was 12 miles away, unprotected, with no naval force left to stop him. And Abe turned his ships around. By sunrise, aircraft from Henderson Field and from the carrier Enterprise were circling the crippled Hiei. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, wave after wave, all day long. By that evening, the crew had been taken off. Escort destroyers scuttled her with torpedoes. The Hiei went down on the night of November 13th, 1942, the first Japanese battleship lost in the Second World War. Yamamoto relieved Abe of command the following day. Now, I want to stop here for just a moment, because I think about this a lot. Mikawa and Abe were not cowards. They were not incompetent. By the standards of virtually any navy in the world at that time, they were exceptional officers, exactly the kind of men you would want commanding your most powerful ships in your most critical battle. But both of them, at the decisive moment, made the same choice. The path was open. The mission was right there. And both of them pulled back. Not because they were afraid exactly, but because everything in their training, everything in the culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy had taught them one thing above all others: preserve the fleet. A warship lost is a warship that cannot be replaced. Protect your ships. Get them home. Fight another day. It was a doctrine that had served Japan brilliantly in the early years of the war. And in Ironbottom Sound, that same doctrine, applied by 2 of the best men Japan had, kept costing them the one thing they couldn't afford to keep losing: time. This wasn't a failure of nerve. It was a failure of doctrine meeting a situation the doctrine wasn't built for. Yamamoto fired Abe. He needed someone else. He needed someone who would finish the job. He turned to the 3rd Admiral. His name was Nobutake Kondo. And I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. Kondo was not chosen because Yamamoto thought he was the best man for the job. He was chosen because by the night of November 14th, 1942, Yamamoto was running out of options. Mikawa had been the brilliant tactician who won a battle and walked away from the war. Abe had been the battleship specialist with a career's worth of combat experience. And he was gone, relieved in disgrace, the hero already on the bottom of this same sound. Kondo was the senior admiral still standing in the South Pacific. The officers who had served under him described him, and these were his own people, his own colleagues, as what they called an English sort of officer. Polished, composed, excellent with his staff. The kind of man who ran a smooth headquarters and gave clear briefings. Better suited, they said, for training command than for battle. Yamamoto sent him anyway, because there was nobody else. On the evening of November 14th, Kondo assembled what he had: the Kirishima, the last remaining battleship, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 9 destroyers. His mission was the same mission Mikawa had been given in August, the same mission Abe had failed to complete 36 hours earlier. Get into Ironbottom Sound, shell Henderson Field, get out before dawn. One night. Same mission, same deadline, same trap. What had changed was something Kondo couldn't see and couldn't fully appreciate. In the week since Mikawa had last entered these waters, the United States Navy had been quietly fielding a new piece of equipment. The SG radar, a surface search system that could track warships in total darkness at ranges the Japanese had never encountered. Not the older systems that struggled with clutter and gave ambiguous returns. Something genuinely different. Something that made the night no longer neutral ground. The USS Washington was carrying it, and Washington was waiting. Admiral Willis Lee had been given 2 battleships, the Washington and the South Dakota, and 4 destroyers scraped together from whatever Halsey had available. The destroyers had never trained together. The 2 battleships had operated as a unit for only a matter of days. It was a scratch force, assembled in hours, sent north into waters that had already swallowed dozens of ships. Lee was known throughout the Navy as perhaps its finest gunnery officer. Quiet, methodical, a chain smoker who read detective novels on the bridge between watches. He had won 5 Olympic gold medals in shooting sports in 1920, a fact that his men found oddly reassuring. He entered Ironbottom Sound at dusk and began to wait. Es Falcons. Kondo's force approached around midnight. His ships found Lee's 4 destroyers first and went after them hard. 3 of the 4 were sunk or put out of action within minutes. The 4th limped away, badly damaged. Then the South Dakota's electrical system failed. It was a catastrophic moment of timing. The battleship went briefly dark, and in doing so, she silhouetted herself against a burning destroyer off her port quarter. Japanese searchlights found her almost immediately. Kondo had a lit target and a battleship to shoot at. He ordered everything opened up on the South Dakota. She fought back, but she was taking hits faster than she could track targets. 26 shells struck her in the space of minutes. Her fire control was gone. Her communications were shredded. Her upper works were on fire in 3 places. Kondo may have thought in that moment that the battle was nearly over. He was wrong. While every Japanese gun in the Sound was pointed at South Dakota, Washington was moving. Lee had held her back, letting the destroyers draw fire, using the radar to build a precise picture of every ship in the Sound. Washington had been tracking the Kirishima for several minutes. Her fire control had a solid lock. At 9,000 yards, less than 5 miles, close enough to see the muzzle flashes with the naked eye, Lee gave the order. Washington opened fire. In 7 minutes, 9 16-inch shells, possibly as many as 20 accounts differ, struck the Kirishima. The hits were catastrophic. Her steering was destroyed. Her engine rooms were flooding. She began to list immediately. Kondo ordered the withdrawal. The Kirishima capsized and sank at 3:25 in the morning of November 15th. The second Japanese battleship lost in 48 hours, both of them in the same water. Yamamoto's reaction to Kondo's failure was notably quieter than his reaction to Abe's. He did not relieve Kondo of command. Kondo was the vice commander of the combined fleet, part of the inner circle of the Imperial Navy's senior leadership, with connections and rank that insulated him from the treatment Abe had received. He went back to Truk and kept his command. And the mission that had now cost Japan 2 battleships, dozens of other warships, and the lives of thousands of sailors, was quietly abandoned. Henderson Field was never seriously threatened again. Now we've seen all 3 of them. Mikawa in August, Abe in November, Kondo 24 hours after Abe. 3 different admirals, 3 different nights, 3 different tactical situations. Mikawa won his battle decisively and walked away from the strategic objective. Abe won his battle at enormous cost and pulled back with the target in reach. Kondo lost his battle outright, outmaneuvered by a technology that hadn't existed in this theater 90 days earlier. Each one failed differently. And yet, I keep coming back to the same thing. Look at the decisions each of them made. Not the decisions during the battle, but the decisions before they ever entered the Sound. Mikawa planned for a night engagement. He planned his route down the slot, his attack formation, his withdrawal course. He did not plan for what happened if he completed the tactical mission, but the strategic situation was unchanged by morning. Abe planned for a shore bombardment. He loaded the right ammunition for shelling an airfield, calculated his timing to be in and out before dawn. He did not ask, "What do we do if we win the night battle, but the sun comes up before Henderson is destroyed?" Kondo planned for a repetition of what Abe had almost accomplished. He organized his force, assigned his screening units, set his schedule. He did not plan for radar that could see him coming from 9 miles away in complete darkness. None of them planned for the morning. And here is why that matters. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire surface warfare doctrine around a single concept: the night raid. Fast ships, aggressive tactics, close to point-blank range, torpedoes and gunfire in the dark. Hit them hard, hit them fast, and be gone before they can respond. It was a doctrine forged through years of training and genuine tactical innovation, and in the first year of the Pacific War, it worked brilliantly. Japanese destroyers and cruisers routinely outfought Allied forces in night engagements. The Long Lance torpedo was a weapon with no American equivalent. The crews were superb. But that doctrine had a built-in assumption that nobody questioned. The assumption was that a successful night engagement would be decisive. Get in, do maximum damage, get out. The problem at Ironbottom Sound was that maximum damage to the American surface force, even sinking every ship in the water that night, didn't change the fundamental problem. Henderson Field would still be there at sunrise, still operational, still putting planes in the air against anything Japanese that moved. The raid could win the night. It could not win the campaign. To do that, you needed something the doctrine didn't have a word for: sustained presence, control, the willingness to accept losses over multiple nights in exchange for degrading the airfield to the point where it couldn't recover. That's not a raid. That's an occupation. And nobody in Tokyo, not Yamamoto, not the Naval General Staff, and certainly not any of the 3 admirals sent south, ever stopped to ask whether the mission as designed was actually capable of achieving what the mission was supposed to achieve. They kept sending the best men they had, with the wrong orders. That silence, that institutional inability to say this plan cannot work, is what connects Mikawa and Abe and Kondo. Not cowardice, not incompetence. The habit of accepting a fundamentally flawed objective and executing against it with everything they had, right up until the moment they couldn't anymore. That is the same way they all failed. Japan began the secret evacuation of Guadalcanal in January 1943. By early February, the last of their soldiers had been pulled off the island. The campaign that had consumed 2 battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, 6 months of the combined fleet's fighting strength, and the lives of more than 20,000 men. It was over. It was the last major offensive operation Japan would conduct in the Pacific War. From Guadalcanal forward, they were fighting a retreat. Ironbottom Sound is still there. The Kirishima was found in 1992 by Robert Ballard's expedition, lying upside down in the darkness, her bow blown away by the magazine explosion that had followed the Washington's shells. 4 nautical miles away, the Hyei was found in 2019. Same posture, same fate. Inverted, broken, both of them missing their bows. 2 battleships that Yamamoto had sent as the best answer he had. Same water, same bottom, same darkness. The Laffey's bow guns are still pointing to port, still aimed at the last place the Hiei ever stood. Henderson Field was paved over decades ago. The runway is now an international airport serving Honiara, the capital of the Solomon Islands. Cargo planes land there in the morning. Tourists fly out in the afternoon. The dead water is quiet. I want to come back to something I said at the beginning. 3 admirals, all handpicked by Yamamoto, all failed the same way. And now that you know what happened, really know it, not just the outline but the detail of those 3 nights, I think the answer is both simpler and harder than it first appears. Mikawa wasn't reckless. He made a reasonable calculation with incomplete information. Abe wasn't timid. He had just won a brutal close-quarters fight, and his flagship couldn't steer. Kondo wasn't unprepared. He was outmatched by a technology that hadn't existed in this theater 90 days earlier. Each of them, judged on their own, made defensible decisions. The failure wasn't in those decisions. The failure was upstream, in the mission itself, in the doctrine that shaped it, in a command culture where no one below Yamamoto had the standing or the willingness to say what needed to be said. One night in Ironbottom Sound will never be enough. We are asking our best men to attempt something that cannot be done, the way we are asking them to do it. We need a different answer. That conversation never happened, so they sent Mikawa, then Abe, then Kondo, the best they had, with the wrong mission, into the same water, and the guns of the Laffey are still pointing at the last place the Hiei stood. Nobody moved them. Nobody ever will. I want to ask you something before you go. We've talked tonight about 3 men who accepted a mission that couldn't work, executed it with everything they had, and came up short every time. Yamamoto knew the odds. The Admirals knew the trap, and not one of them said what needed to be said. I'm curious, and I mean this genuinely, not as a throwaway question. Is there a moment in this story where you think someone could have changed it? Was there a point where one person, saying one thing, might have broken the pattern? Because I've been thinking about that question for a long time, and I'm honestly not sure I have a clean answer. Leave it in the comments. I read them, and on a story like this, I want to know what you think.